For almost 50 years, one brutal crime haunted a quiet university town. A young woman with a brilliant future was found dead inside her locked dorm room, leaving behind no signs of forced entry, just two mysterious coffee cups and a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Investigators were baffled. Suspects came and went. Leads grew cold. Generations passed while a killer walked free, blending into society as a respected professor, neighbor, and family man. What no one knew was that crucial evidence sat untouched for decades, waiting for science to catch up. And when it finally did, the truth shattered everything the community thought they knew. This is the chilling story of a murder unsolved for nearly half a century, and the forensic breakthrough that exposed the predator hiding in plain sight. Catherine Fitzgerald was a 22-year-old psychology student at Westbridge University, a quiet college town known for its close-knit community and peaceful atmosphere. She stood out from the very beginning, not just because of her intelligence, but because of her warm personality. Friends described her as kind, thoughtful, and always willing to help anyone in need. Professors admired her sharp mind and strong sense of curiosity. She dreamed of becoming a psychologist to help children who were struggling, and she was already working on a promising research project that impressed many at the university. She lived in a small but cozy dormitory building on campus, where most students felt safe. Catherine's dorm room was on the second floor, facing a row of tall maple trees that lined the main path. She was known for keeping her door open during the day, welcoming friends to stop by for coffee or conversation. She had a small desk by the window, a few shelves filled with books, and a neat bed with a hand-stitched quilt her mother had made. Her life seemed stable, bright, and full of promise. But everything changed on a cold January morning in 1971, when Catherine didn't show up for her morning lecture, something she had never done before. Her friends grew worried. She was known for being punctual and responsible. At first they thought she might have overslept, but after repeated knocks on her door went unanswered, a dorm supervisor was called to check on her. What they found inside would haunt the campus for decades. The door to her room was locked from the inside. When it was finally opened with a master key, Catherine was found lying lifeless on the floor. Her body was positioned near her desk, and there were no signs of forced entry. Her face showed no obvious injuries, but a silk scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck. Later, the medical examiner confirmed that the scarf was the cause of death. She had been strangled. On the desk sat two coffee cups. One had her fingerprints. The other had been carefully wiped clean, as if someone had deliberately tried to remove all evidence. There were no signs of a struggle in the room. Her books were neatly stacked, her belongings untouched, and nothing appeared to be stolen. The locked door and the clean second cup created a disturbing puzzle for investigators. News of her death spread through the campus like wildfire. Students gathered in shock, whispering in hallways and crowding outside the dormitory, unable to believe what had happened. Westbridge University had always felt like a safe place, but now fear and confusion filled the air. For many students, this was the first time they had ever experienced something so dark, so close to home. Catherine's professors were heartbroken. Many of them had taught her since her first year and saw her as one of the brightest minds of her generation. Friends broke down in tears, describing how she had helped them through hard times and how full of life she had been only the night before. Her parents, upon receiving the devastating news, rushed to campus. The image of them arriving in tears stayed with witnesses for years afterward. Local police immediately launched a full investigation. Detectives were puzzled by the scene. A locked door, no forced entry, and very few clues. It looked like Catherine had willingly let someone into her room, someone she trusted enough to share coffee with. Whoever that person was had been careful, leaving behind no clear fingerprints or footprints. The murder of Catherine Fitzgerald shook not only the university but also the entire town. It dominated local headlines, filled newspapers for weeks, and sparked fear among students and parents alike. People began locking their doors more carefully, avoiding walking alone at night, and questioning everyone around them. Catherine's death marked the beginning of one of the most haunting unsolved cases in the region's history. Her bright future had been cut short in the most unexpected and cruel way, leaving behind unanswered questions that would linger for decades. The shocking discovery of Catherine Fitzgerald's body immediately set off one of the most intense investigations the small town of Westbridge had ever seen. For many in the community, this wasn't just another crime. It was a brutal attack on a bright, kind young woman in a place where everyone believed they were safe. Within hours, the dormitory building was surrounded by police officers, detectives, and forensic teams. Investigators sealed off Catherine's room and began carefully collecting evidence. They photographed the scene, took fingerprints, and collected the coffee cups, scarf, and other items for examination. Since the door had been locked from the inside and there was no sign of forced entry, investigators believed that Catherine must have known her killer. This theory guided much of the early investigation. Detectives began by interviewing Catherine's close friends, classmates, professors, and anyone who might have seen her the night before. Many remembered seeing her on campus that evening. She had attended a study session at the library and chatted with a few friends before returning to her dorm around 9 p.m. Nothing about her behavior seemed unusual. She was cheerful and focused, talking about her upcoming research work. The first person investigators looked at was her boyfriend, Michael. They had been dating for nearly a year, and although their relationship had the usual ups and downs, there were no signs of serious conflict. Michael was brought in for questioning early the next morning. Detectives examined his whereabouts on the night of the murder. He claimed he had been at his part-time job at a local diner, which was later confirmed by his co-workers and time cards. He was visibly shaken during questioning, repeatedly insisting that he loved Catherine and would never hurt her. After a thorough interview and background check, investigators found no physical evidence linking him to the crime. He was eventually ruled out as a suspect. Next, the focus shifted to people who had access to the dormitory. One of the individuals questioned was a janitor who worked in the building. He had a criminal record from years earlier, which made him an immediate person of interest. He admitted that he had been in the hallway earlier in the evening but denied entering Catherine's room. His fingerprints were collected and compared to those found at the scene. None matched the wiped coffee cup and nothing tied him directly to the murder. He also had a solid alibi. He had been cleaning another part of the building during the time investigators believed the crime occurred. As the investigation progressed, detectives started looking into Catherine's professors and classmates. Among them was Professor David Kowalski, a respected figure in the psychology department. He had taught Catherine since her first year and had worked with her on research projects. Several students had seen Catherine talking with him shortly before she returned to her dorm that night. When questioned, Kowalski explained that they had discussed academic work and that he went home afterward. He provided an alibi that was supported by his wife, and there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime at the time. The police also examined Catherine's personal life closely. They searched her dorm room for journals, letters, or notes that might give insight into any personal conflicts or threats. They spoke with her family, who described Catherine as happy and focused on her studies. There were no reports of enemies or troubling relationships. Despite their efforts, investigators quickly began to run into roadblocks. Fingerprint analysis at the time was limited, and the wiped coffee cup gave them nothing useful. DNA testing didn't exist in 1971, so the scarf, which would later become a crucial piece of evidence, couldn't be tested in a meaningful way. Interviews led to more questions than answers. Everyone seemed to have alibis. The case grew more frustrating as days turned into weeks. Police continued to receive tips from students and townspeople, but most led nowhere. The locked door mystery added another layer of confusion. How could someone commit such a brutal act, leave no trace, and lock the door behind them? Some speculated that Catherine might have locked the door herself after letting someone in, not realizing the danger she was in. Others believed the killer had intimate knowledge of the dorm's layout or possessed a master key. As time passed, media attention intensified. Newspapers ran daily stories, speculating on suspects and motives. Students on campus grew more fearful. Many refused to stay in the dormitory overnight, choosing to sleep at friends' houses or even return home temporarily. Parents called the university demanding answers, while Catherine's grieving family pushed for justice. Despite the heavy pressure, the investigation eventually stalled. With no strong leads, no physical evidence, and no confession, detectives had no choice but to admit that the case had gone cold. Catherine's killer remained unidentified, leaving behind a deep wound in the community, and a haunting mystery that would stay unsolved for decades. After the initial investigation lost momentum, Catherine Fitzgerald's case slowly shifted from a headline story to a painful, unresolved memory. As the months passed with no arrest, hope began to fade. The police had interviewed dozens of people, examined every piece of evidence available in 1971, and followed every lead they could, but nothing brought them closer to the truth. Eventually, the investigation was officially labeled a cold case. For Catherine's family, this was unbearable. Her parents had raised her with love and pride. She was their eldest daughter, the one who always made them proud with her grades, kindness, and ambition. Losing her in such a brutal way was devastating enough, but living without answers made the pain even deeper. Every day they wondered who had done it, and why. They asked themselves over and over if they had missed any warning signs. Catherine's younger sister, Margaret, was a teenager at the time of the murder. She adored Catherine and looked up to her as both a sister and a role model. Margaret's life changed completely after Catherine's death. She watched her parents grieve silently and saw how the house that was once filled with laughter had become quiet and heavy with sadness. Her sister's unsolved case left a mark on her heart that never faded. As she grew older, that pain turned into determination. Inspired by Catherine's story and frustrated by the lack of justice, Margaret decided to study law. She eventually became a prosecutor, driven by the hope that one day she might help solve her sister's case. Meanwhile, Catherine's murder continued to haunt the Westbridge community. Over the years, new students arrived at the university and professors came and went, but Catherine's story was never forgotten. Her death became something of a legend on campus, whispered about during late-night conversations in the dorms. Students passed down the story of the brilliant young woman whose life ended mysteriously in a locked room. Some treated it like a ghost story. Others treated it with the seriousness it deserved, recognizing the real pain behind the tale. Every few years, as investigative methods improved or new detectives joined the force, the case file was pulled out again. The evidence, including the 2 coffee cups and the silk scarf, had been carefully preserved. Detectives reviewed witness statements, examined photos, and tried to find something that might have been overlooked, but the same challenges remained. The coffee cup with wiped fingerprints offered no clues. The locked door scenario gave no new answers. And without modern DNA technology, the scarf could not reveal anything. The original detectives eventually retired, and new ones inherited the cold case files. Each brought their own perspective and fresh energy, but the trail had grown cold long ago. Witnesses had moved away or passed on, memories had faded, and potential suspects had built entire lives over the decades. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Catherine's parents never stopped hoping for justice. They attended every memorial, spoke with investigators, and kept her memory alive in the community. On each anniversary of her death, local newspapers published short reminders of the case, urging anyone with information to come forward, but no new leads ever surfaced. As time went on, science began to advance. Investigators started to use new methods like DNA analysis to solve crimes that had once seemed impossible to crack. Families across the country began to see justice in cases that had been unsolved for decades. Margaret followed these developments closely. She knew that as technology improved, there might one day be a way to examine the evidence from Catherine's case again. Still, the years dragged on. The suspect who had taken Catherine's life remained free. He had blended into society, growing older, working, raising a family, and appearing to be a respectable member of the community. Meanwhile, Catherine's family was left to grow old without answers. Her parents both passed away before the case was solved, never knowing who killed their daughter. For Margaret, this was one of the hardest truths to accept. By the late 1990s, nearly 3 decades had passed. The world had changed. Technology had advanced, society had evolved, and Westbridge University had transformed with new buildings and new faces. But the pain of Catherine's death still lingered. Her story was still discussed in classrooms, at alumni gatherings, and in quiet corners of the town. The unanswered questions were always the same. Who killed Catherine Fitzgerald? How did they manage to leave no trace? And why did they do it? Those questions hung over the case like a shadow, waiting for the day when someone or something could finally bring the truth to light. By the early 2000s, technology had reached a point where cases once thought unsolvable were being reopened and cracked wide open. Across the country, cold cases were being solved thanks to incredible advancements in forensic science, especially DNA analysis. What once required a large, clean sample could now be done with just a tiny trace left behind on clothing, a cup, or even a single hair. Margaret Fitzgerald, now an experienced prosecutor, had never stopped thinking about her sister's case. Even after decades, she kept in touch with investigators, regularly asking if any new testing could be done on the preserved evidence. She had learned that the 2 coffee cups and the silk scarf had been carefully stored in a climate-controlled evidence room, protected from contamination. This gave her hope. In 2005, a new detective named Daniel Brooks joined the cold case unit. He was young, determined, and passionate about solving forgotten cases. When he stumbled upon Catherine Fitzgerald's case file, something about it drew him in immediately. The locked room mystery, the untouched evidence, and the heartbreaking story of a brilliant young woman struck a chord with him. Daniel decided to take a fresh look. He pulled the boxes from storage and carefully laid everything out in the evidence room. The silk scarf was still neatly sealed in its original packaging. The coffee cups were stored separately. Daniel read through the original reports, noting every small detail. He was shocked by how thorough the investigators in 1971 had been. Even without the tools available today, they had preserved everything with remarkable care. Daniel contacted a modern forensic lab that specialized in testing cold case evidence. He explained the history of the case and asked if they could run touch DNA testing on the scarf and the coffee cups. Touch DNA can pick up even the tiniest skin cells left behind from contact. The lab agreed, but the process wouldn't be quick. Cold case testing often takes months, sometimes even years, because active cases take priority. Margaret was informed that Catherine's evidence was being retested. For her, this news felt like a spark of light in a long tunnel of darkness. She had lived her entire adult life carrying her sister's memory, working in the justice system, and hoping for this very moment. She didn't let herself get too excited. She had been disappointed before, but she quietly allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, this could finally lead to answers. Months passed. Daniel stayed persistent, regularly checking in with the lab. Finally, in 2006, the results arrived. Scientists had managed to extract a partial DNA profile from the silk scarf, one that did not belong to Catherine. It was clear, strong, and suitable for comparison. This was the first major breakthrough in the case in over 3 decades. The DNA was immediately uploaded to CODIS, the national DNA database. CODIS compares unknown DNA samples against profiles collected from convicted offenders, arrestees, and other unsolved cases. The hope was simple. Maybe the killer's DNA was already in the system. The team waited anxiously for results. But when the comparison came back, there was no match. The killer's DNA wasn't in the database. This was disappointing. But Daniel didn't see it as a failure. Instead, it meant they finally had a real piece of the killer, something that could be used in the future. In the years that followed, the case gained renewed interest. Forensic methods continued to improve, and the idea of genetic genealogy, using public ancestry databases to track down relatives of unknown suspects, started gaining attention after solving several high-profile cases. Daniel and Margaret watched these developments closely. By 2018, this new method had revolutionized criminal investigations. Detectives could upload an unknown DNA profile to certain public genealogy databases and find distant relatives of the suspect. From there, genealogists built family trees, narrowing down possible suspects until they found a match. Daniel knew it was time to give Catherine's case another push. He worked with a genetic genealogy team, and in late 2018, the scarf DNA was uploaded for genealogy analysis. This time they got a hit, not to the killer himself, but to a distant cousin. Over the next several months, genealogists meticulously pieced together the suspect's family tree, tracing connections, marriages, and generations. Eventually, one name stood out: Richard Hale, a former graduate student who had attended Westbridge University in the early 1970s. At the time of the murder, he had lived in a building near Catherine's dorm. He had never been a strong suspect back then. He was charming, well-liked, and had no criminal record. But now the DNA pointed toward his branch of the family tree. Detectives began quietly investigating his past, retracing his movements, and collecting information to see if he could be the one. For the first time in nearly 50 years, Catherine's case had a real tangible lead, all thanks to the power of modern forensic science. As genealogists and investigators focused on the DNA match, the name Richard Hale kept surfacing again and again. Richard had been a graduate student in the psychology department at Westbridge University in 1971, the same department Catherine Fitzgerald belonged to. At the time, he was 26 years old, working as a teaching assistant, and was described by many as intelligent, charming, and polite. He lived only a short walk away from Catherine's dormitory, and their paths likely crossed often on campus. Back in 1971, Richard was briefly interviewed by police because of his proximity to the crime scene, but nothing about him had stood out as suspicious. He had no criminal history, gave a calm statement, and seemed cooperative. Without physical evidence linking him to the scene, investigators had no reason to consider him a serious suspect. As years passed, he disappeared into the background of the case, just one of many names in the old files. But now, almost 5 decades later, DNA had placed a spotlight on him. His branch of the family tree, traced through genetic genealogy, fit perfectly with the unknown DNA profile from the silk scarf. Investigators began to quietly build a picture of Richard's life after the murder. What they found was unsettling. Richard Hale had left Westbridge University shortly after Catherine's death. He moved to another state, completed his education, and eventually became a respected school counselor. He married, had children, and built a seemingly ordinary life. Over the years, he received community awards and was known as a helpful, friendly neighbor. No one around him ever suspected he carried such a dark secret. Detective Daniel Brooks and his team knew they needed to be absolutely certain before confronting him. They began a careful undercover investigation. Surveillance teams followed Richard, now in his 70s, as he went about his daily life. They watched him visit grocery stores, walk his dog, and meet with friends. Their goal was to collect a discarded DNA sample, something like a coffee cup, tissue, or straw that he had thrown away, to compare it directly to the DNA found on the scarf. One day, after Richard stopped at a small coffee shop, investigators collected the cup he had left behind in the trash. The cup was sent to the forensic lab for analysis. Everyone waited anxiously. When the results returned, the answer was clear. The DNA on the cup matched the DNA found on Catherine's silk scarf. After nearly 50 years, they had finally identified the man who killed Catherine Fitzgerald. Daniel immediately contacted Margaret Fitzgerald. She was now in her 60s, but she had never given up on her sister's case. When she heard the news, she sat in silence for several seconds, letting the words sink in. Tears filled her eyes. It was a moment she had imagined thousands of times, but actually hearing it felt overwhelming. Her voice shook as she whispered, "We found him?" Daniel replied softly, "Yes, it's him." A few days later, police moved in. Richard Hale was arrested outside his suburban home. The neighbors were stunned. They watched as the elderly man, who had always seemed kind and harmless, was placed in handcuffs. News of the arrest spread quickly. For many in the community, it was shocking to realize that a respected counselor had lived among them all these years with such a horrifying past. During questioning, Richard at first denied any involvement, but when he was confronted with the DNA evidence, his calm mask began to crack. Investigators laid out the evidence: the scarf, the genealogical match, the discarded cup. Slowly, he realized there was no way out. Eventually, he admitted to having been with Catherine that night, claiming they had coffee together. But his version of events quickly fell apart under scrutiny. His story was full of contradictions, and the DNA around the scarf, the murder weapon, spoke louder than his excuses. Margaret attended every hearing. She watched him closely, searching for some sign of remorse. Richard showed little emotion, maintaining a cold and distant demeanor. For Margaret, seeing the man who took her sister's life was both painful and strangely relieving. For the first time, the mystery that had haunted her entire life had a face and a name. In court, prosecutors laid out the timeline. They explained how Richard had likely visited Catherine under the pretense of discussing coursework or personal matters. He shared coffee with her, then attacked her with the silk scarf, leaving the scene staged to look like a puzzle. A locked room, a wiped cup, hoping to outsmart investigators, and for a long time he had succeeded. But science had caught up with him. The identification of Richard Hale marked a turning point. What had been a story of unanswered questions for decades now became a story of justice and closure for Catherine's friends and the Westbridge community. It felt like an old wound was finally being acknowledged. For Margaret, it was the moment she had been waiting for her entire life. The arrest of Richard Hale sent shockwaves through both the local community and the national media. Newspapers carried headlines like "Cold Case Solved After 48 Years" and "DNA Breakthrough Identifies Dorm Room Killer." For nearly half a century, Catherine Fitzgerald's story had remained an unsolved mystery, but now the man responsible was finally standing before a judge. Richard, now in his early 70s, walked slowly into the courtroom wearing handcuffs. His once respected image, the school counselor, the friendly neighbor, the quiet man who lived a normal life, had been shattered overnight. The courtroom was filled with reporters, law students, retired detectives, and most importantly, Margaret Fitzgerald. She sat in the front row every single day, clutching an old photo of Catherine in her graduation gown. The trial became a landmark moment. Prosecutors presented the story step by step. The events of that January morning in 1971, the careful preservation of the scarf and coffee cups, the decades of searching, and finally the DNA match that had broken the silence. They explained how Richard had used his position as a teaching assistant to gain Catherine's trust, how he had been in her dorm room that morning, and how he had likely planned the attack to make it appear like a mystery no one could solve. The defense tried to argue that the DNA didn't prove murder, only that he had been in the room, but the prosecution countered with the crucial fact: his DNA was found on the silk scarf, the murder weapon. There was no innocent explanation for that. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Margaret gave her victim impact statement. She stood before the court, her voice steady but emotional, and spoke directly to Richard. "For 48 years, you lived freely while our family lived in pain. You watched the world change, built a life, and aged without consequences. My parents died without knowing the truth. Catherine never got to fulfill her dreams, never got to grow old. You took her future, and you left us with silence. But today, that silence is broken. Today, justice finally speaks for her." Her words brought many in the courtroom to tears. Even some of the jurors visibly wiped their eyes. It was a reminder that behind the headlines and evidence, this was about a young woman whose life had been stolen. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom grew silent. The foreperson stood and read the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Margaret closed her eyes as tears rolled down her cheeks. After nearly 5 decades, the moment she had waited for had finally arrived. Richard Hale showed little emotion. As the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his age didn't lessen the seriousness of his crime. The judge's words were firm. "For 48 years, you carried a secret that tore a family apart and haunted a community. Thanks to perseverance and modern science, the truth has finally emerged. You will spend the rest of your life facing the justice you thought you had escaped." Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Margaret addressed reporters. She didn't speak like a prosecutor that day. She spoke like a sister. "This is not about revenge. This is about justice. Catherine deserved to have her story told, and today she finally has a voice. I want people to know that no matter how much time passes, hope should never die. The truth has a way of finding the light." The case also became a symbol for how cold cases can be solved through persistence and science. Law enforcement agencies across the country referenced Catherine's case as an example of why evidence preservation is so important. Detectives who had once worked on the case in the 1970s, now old and retired, watched the news with emotion. Some said they had always hoped this day would come, even if they weren't the ones to solve it. For Westbridge University, Catherine's story became part of the campus's legacy. A scholarship in her name was created to support young women in psychology, the field she loved. Each year, new students would learn about Catherine Fitzgerald, not just as a victim but as a brilliant young woman whose case proved that justice may be delayed, but it is never impossible. Margaret visited Catherine's grave shortly after the sentencing. She placed fresh flowers down and whispered, "We did it, Kathy." For the first time in her life, the air around her felt lighter. The unanswered questions that had followed her for decades were finally laid to rest. Catherine Fitzgerald's story reminds us that even when time passes and memories fade, the truth can still be uncovered. Through determination, science, and the unwavering pursuit of justice, a mystery that remained unsolved for nearly 5 decades was finally brought to light. Her case is not just about solving a crime, it's about the power of never giving up, no matter how long it takes. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe for more real cases where justice triumphs against the odds. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know which case you'd like us to cover next. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and bring attention to those still waiting for answers.